Okay, hello, and we've been talking about hello and welcome to everyone for joining us today to participate in our program on Harriet Tubman, presented by Leon DiMartino. I'm Mary Ann Marrero. I'm president of the Friends of the Moffat Library, and we are hosting the program today via Zoom, provided by the Moffat Library with the great assist of David Sadoff. Thank you again, David. And as David has mentioned, just some housekeeping, the program is going to be recorded and available on the Moffat Library YouTube. And when the program begins, we ask you to mute yourself and close out your video so we can concentrate on Leon's presentation. Okay, Ruth, I'm going to ask Ruth Mannion now to introduce Leon to us. Thank you.
I'm delighted to be able to introduce Leon DiMartino. Leon has a master's degree in educational psychology and history, and has taught courses at many nearby institutions. He has been a frequent instructor at Mount St. Mary College at the Desmond Campus, as well as at Westchester Community College, Newtown, Connecticut, Newtown, Connecticut High School Adult Education Program, and the City of Stamford, Connecticut Adult Ed Program as well. In addition, his presentations at the Putnam County History Museum in Cold Springs, the Warner Library in Tarrytown, as well as the Briarcliff, New York Public Library have been enjoyed by a wide audience in the Hudson Valley. The Friends of the Moffat Library, in recognition of Black History Month, is delighted to have Leon here to talk about the life and times of Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. So it's all yours, Leon.
Okay, thank you, Ruth, appreciate it. Well, welcome everybody, and this is going to be our presentation on the life and times of Harriet Tubman, often referred to as the Moses of her people. And we'll start now. Just bear with me a minute, please. Okay, before you talk about Harriet Tubman, you have to know a little bit about the background and how she grew up and what conditions were like in the United States in the years leading up to from the colonization to when we actually became an independent nation. Now, slavery existed in North America long before the United States was a nation. It was originally introduced by the Spanish and the Portuguese settlers in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. But in North America, it's the British who actually introduced slavery in the 1600s. And it was believed that the first slaves were imported into colonial America in the period of 1607 to 1609. And that would have been in the town of Jamestown, Virginia, one of the first early settlements in colonial America. And by the time we got to the American Revolutionary War in 1776, slavery had already existed over 150 years or more within the United States. And it wouldn't actually be abolished until 1865, when the Federal Congress passes the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which will eliminate slavery within the United States. Now, in the years leading up to the Civil War, the northern states would become free of slavery, while the southern states would introduce slavery as an essential part of their economic system, which was based upon a plantation economy. Okay, just bear with me a minute. Just having a little, okay. Now, what happens in the United States is there's an early movement to abolish slavery, and the people that originate that movement were referred to as abolitionists. And some of the very first and major abolitionist leaders within the United States would be the Quakers, the Quaker community. And they would get involved in something that would be called the Underground Railroad. And the Underground Railroad was not a railroad, but it was a movement that would bring slaves from the southern states north, where they would be free of slavery and bondage. the idea was that the northern states and colonial America, and also when we became an independent nation, didn't have slavery, or it wasn't as prevalently practiced as it was in the South. Now, here's a famous saying by Harriet Tubman, and she has a couple of really good ones, and I always thought this was a great one myself. And it goes, "Every great dream begins with a dreamer. Always remember, you have within you the strength, the patience, and the passion to reach the stars or to change the world." It's equally as good a saying today as it was when she first said it. Now, a little bit on Harriet Tubman, and this will give you an idea more about who she was and what she was involved with. She was born, actually, Araminta Ross in March of 1822 in Dorchester County, Maryland, and she dies on March 10th, 1913 in Auburn, New York. And since records weren't that well kept in those days, they believe she either died at the age of 90 or 91, but it's not quite certain because they don't know what exact day she was born in March of 1822. However, her final resting place is the Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn, New York. And during her lifetime, she was known as an American abolitionist, as well as a political activist. Now, what happens to Araminta Ross is that she marries and changes her name. In 1844, she marries a free man of color named John Tubman, and it was believed at the time of her marriage that she changes her first name from Araminta to Harriet. The marriage between freed people of color and slaves were common in Maryland of the 1840s. And it would be during this period of time that Harriet may have intended to become free by either having her husband purchase her freedom or escaping from the marriage. The choice she makes is to escape from the marriage. Interesting enough. Now, here's a picture of Harriet and John Tubman. It was taken somewhere between the years of 1844 and 1851. And this would be before Harriet chooses to abandon the marriage and pursue freedom in the northern states. Now, she escaped slavery, actually, in 1849. And it's a year that's significant in Harriet's lifetime because she makes her way out of Maryland and goes as far north as Philadelphia. And slowly she would return to Maryland and start to guide her relatives and other slaves north to freedom on the Underground Railroad. And she would become one of the most successful conductors, as they would call the folks that led those movements on the Underground Railroad. And it is said that she had led thousands of slaves north to freedom in the years that led up to the American Civil War. She often made these trips in the dead of night and in extreme secrecy, conducting trips on the Underground Railroad. One of the claims that was well made was it was said that she never lost one passenger on many of her trips north on the Underground Railroad. Now, this is an interesting fact, too. Traveling in the dead of night and traveling very light, one has to learn to live off the land. And it was Harriet's father who taught her how to read the stars, predict the weather, gather wild berries, and make cures from roots. These are all skills that Harriet would use as she conducted the many various trips that she made from the south to the north on the Underground Railroad. A lesson that's well learned today, how to survive in the open wilderness. Now, a little bit about the Underground Railroad itself. What we were talking about, and maybe explain it a little more clearly, is that it's a network of secret routes and safe houses, and it was established between the early 1700s and mid-19th century by abolitionists, and mostly Quakers to start with, that would allow for enslaved Afro-Americans to escape north into the free states, and not only north into the free states, but later on even to Canada and Mexico. So the railroad had many diverse geographic locations it worked with to bring people to freedom, but depending on what part of that decade between the 1840s and the beginning of the Civil War, the routes would change periodically. Now, it lasted until the early days of the Civil War, as we said, and Harriet Tubman would become known as one of the more famous conductors on the Underground Railroad, which consisted of safe houses and safe routes that led north to freedom. And it is estimated that as many as 100,000 Afro-Americans had gained their freedom by way of the Underground Railroad in the year of 1850. These are a couple of beautiful illustrations of some of the trips that it was proposed Harriet Tubman would have made on her Underground Railroad trips. And one of the things we were talking about, having those skills of being able to navigate with the stars and being able to find berries and being able to use roots to make cures, you had to make these trips in all kinds of different conditions of weather. And here's one illustration that shows what one of those trips would have been like in the winter months, and another one perhaps in the summer. But each season of the year had its own hazards that Harriet would have had to face and overcome as she brought her passengers north on the Underground Railroad. A key point in the development of the abolition of slavery comes in the year of 1850 with the Fugitive Slave Act. It's on September 18th of 1850 that the United States Federal Congress passes the Fugitive Slave Act. And this allows slaves that escaped from the South to be recaptured and returned to the South. And Harriet Tubman, in turn, would have to reroute her trips, and she would start to leave her groups further north, away from the northern American states, into what was called at that time British North America. Today we would know British North America as Canada, but in the years prior to 1868, when Canada would gain her own independence, she was always referred to at that point in time as British North America. Interesting enough, I spend a lot of time in Canada on vacations and trips, and I could tell you, as far as the Atlantic provinces of Canada, descendants of some of those Underground Railroad trips exist in whole communities. I know of at least one of them that exists up in Nova Scotia. So that's quite a distance to sort of navigate as well. And, you know, there are whole communities up in Canada, as well as different parts of the northern United States, which are descended from those passengers that made the original trips on the Underground Railroad. Now, during that period of time, starting from 1849, leading up to the 1850 Congressional Act, you started to see a lot of these reward posters appearing. Starting in 1849, they would appear in local towns and newspapers, offering rewards for runaway slaves. And with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, you would see more and more of these posters and bills placed in various towns, and also with advertisements put into regional and local newspapers. Now, to give you an idea of some of the routes of the Underground Railroad, and this is just a sampling, starting in Dorchester, Maryland, Dorchester County, which is where Harriet Tubman was from. She would make her way up to Pennsylvania and then further north to Auburn, New York. And in the years of the Slave Act in 1850, they would make their way over to Ontario Province, Canada, starting with the city of St. Catharines. So from there, they would sort of expand into different parts of the Canadian territories and provincial systems. And as I said, I know of communities up in Nova Scotia as well. Another famous Harriet Tubman quote, and she had quite a few of them, incidentally. There were one or two things I have a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would take the other. For no man shall take me alive. I shall fight for liberty as long as my strength lasts. This would even be a quote that could have been used by some of the people of the generation of the American Revolution. Freedom is an important issue, and from the birth of our nation through the abolition of slavery, and even today, it's an important issue to many Americans. Now, Harriet Tubman was also associated during the 1840s with other members of the abolitionist community, and among them would have been John Brown, Frederick Douglass, Germaine Lugren, and Gerrit Smith. And we'll talk about each of them. John Brown is perhaps one of the more well-known abolitionists, but there's something that makes him unique from the others, and we'll discuss that now. John Brown was actually born on May 9th, 1800 in Torrington, Connecticut, and he dies on December 2nd, 1859 in Charlestown, Virginia, at the age of 59. During his lifetime, he was known as an American abolitionist. What made him unique from the other abolitionists was that he was one of the few who advocated armed insurrection to overthrow slavery. He was the only one of the major abolitionists that took that approach. Because of that, that's where he gets himself into a whole mess of trouble. During the period leading up to a Harpers Ferry raid, which is where he makes his reputation. In 1858, there's an election, a federal election for the presidency, and the Southerners, or the people from the southern states, always felt threatened by the Republicans who came into office in 1858 and came in on a platform of abolition of slavery. So that was an issue that was starting to divide the nation in the years leading up to the Civil War. It's on October 16th of 1859 that John Brown leads a group on a raid on the Harpers Ferry, Virginia military arsenal. His target was to acquire weapons, and what Brown wanted to do was to arm slaves and start a revolt against slaveholders. And it was rumored that some abolitionist groups within the movement had also paid for John Brown to get the forces together to make this raid. Unfortunately, it goes badly for John Brown. And interesting enough, he had also invited Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass to accompany him on the raid. And wisely at the time, I think both refused to do so because they didn't feel that armed insurrection was a way of abolishing slavery. John Brown, of course, because he's captured and he's put on trial, he eventually will be hanged, and his reputation will be laid low because of is pushing forth the idea of armed insurrection. Now, on a more peaceful nature, Frederick Douglass is still a very popular and famous abolitionist today. But in addition to being an abolitionist, he was a great talker or orator. He was a social reformer, a statesman, and a writer. He was born in February of 1818, and he dies on February 20th of 1895 in Washington, D.C. at the age of 77. And his background included being a former slave himself. He became a major leading voice in the Afro-American community. He was an American minister to the country of Haiti in the period of 1889 to 1891. And he also authored 3 books. The first one was the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, which was an autobiography published in 1845. And in 1855, they published his My Bondage and Freedom. And then the third book that Frederick Douglass had written was The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, which would have been published in 1881. Another famous, and these are all people that would have traveled in the same circle as Harriet Tubman. Another one of those people would have been the Reverend Jermaine Wesley Lugren, and he was born on February 5th of 1813, and he was actually born into slavery as well in Davidson County, Tennessee. He dies on September 30th, 1872 at the age of 59. Now, during Reverend Lugren's lifetime, he was considered an abolitionist, a public speaker, and he was also a bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. He's also author of a slave narrative, which was entitled The Reverend J.W. Lugren as a Slave and as a Free Man, a Narrative of Real Life. And that work was published in 1859. And one more member of significance in the abolitionist movement of that era, which Harriet Tubman would have associated with, would have been Gerrit Smith. Gerrit Smith was born March 6, 1797 in Utica, New York, and he dies on December 28, 1874 in New York City at the age of 77. During his lifetime, his occupations included being an abolitionist, a social reformer, a politician, and a philanthropist. He served in the U.S. Federal Congress as a representative from the state of New York in the years of 1853 to 1854. And what's interesting about Gerrit Smith is that Frederick Douglass actually dedicates one of his 3 books to Gerrit Smith, and that is the one that was published in 1855 entitled My Bondage and My Freedom. There was a historic building up in Peterborough, New York, which was the Gerrit Smith homestead, and it would have been one of our historic treasures to hold on to. Unfortunately, the building does burn down in 1936. What you have here is a picture of what the Gerrit Smith homestead would have looked like that was actually taken out of a book. Now, another famous Harriet Tubman quote, "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more. If only they knew they were slaves." This is a very significant quote also in the life of Harriet Tubman. If you think of it, what she's really saying is slavery is not only a condition of the body, but it's also a condition of the mind. And isn't that an interesting thought to leave people with, to contemplate? Okay, and we'll continue. Now, in the years that led up to the Civil War, Harriet Tubman would sort of change her career slightly from being a conductor on the Underground Railroad to an abolitionist, scout, nurse, and spy. And She would follow these activities in the years of 1861 to 1865. How she gets involved in the Civil War is she sees an opportunity to free slaves in the South during the Civil War years, and she starts by joining up with a group of Philadelphia and Boston abolitionists that are headed to Hilton Head, South Carolina, to assist slaves that have been freed in the Confederate States. And in 1861, she becomes a fixture in the recently captured Port Royal, South Carolina, and she helps to provide assistance to those freed slaves in the community of Port Royal. Now, with the encouragement of Harriet Tubman and other abolitionists, the federal government will eventually issue what's called the Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863. And what the Emancipation Proclamation does is it frees all slaves in captured regions of the Southern Confederacy. She would also become influential in encouraging former slaves freed by the Union Army to actually become Union soldiers and continue to fight in the cause to abolish slavery from 1863 onward, which is when the act was passed. It's also believed that Harriet may have had influence on both President Lincoln and the federal Congress in the cause of the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, in addition to having that act passed by Congress, she also acted as a spy and a scout and a nurse for the Union Army. And she also encouraged freed slaves in the former territories of the Confederacy to join up with the Union Army. And she would even lead some of them on missions, which we'll talk about next. Now, between June 1st and 2nd of 1863, Harriet Tubman would lead an expedition of approximately 150 Afro-American soldiers of the Massachusetts 54th Regiment onto the South Carolina lowlands of Beaufort and Colleton counties. The expedition freed and transported an estimated 750 free slaves to their freedom as a result of the raid. And many of these freed slaves would also join up in the Union Army as well. Now, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry is a very significant unit. It is a unit of Afro-American soldiers, and it was famous in the history of Massachusetts as well, and in a recent movie, which we'll talk about. This plaque that I have pictured here, now if you look at it closely, I've seen the original. It's actually in downtown Boston, and it's at the far end of the Boston Commons or Park, directly across the street from the Massachusetts State House in downtown Boston. And this particular plaque is dedicated to the 54th Infantry during the Civil War. The sad thing about it is that Harriet Tubman would have led these soldiers on a raid on Confederate territory, but less than a month later, they would perish in a assault by Union forces on Fort Wagner, South Carolina. And the plaque, of course, is dedicated to those soldiers. The officer who's actually pictured here, Edwin Gould Shore, was a Union commander. He also was a student as a young man. He never finished his degree at Fordham University in the Bronx, which is interesting. So he had some local roots as well as being a Massachusetts son. The story of the Massachusetts 54th Infantry that Harriet would have led on the raid was actually told in the 1989 movie Glory, which actually won an award up at the Toronto Film Festival. It is still a popular movie that you occasionally can see on television today. And the story they tell is the raid on Fort Wagner and what happens as a result. Here's a picture of Harriet Tubman, actually, with some of the Black Union soldiers. Many of these might have been possibly members of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. And she made efforts to recruit slaves from the former freed territories to join up with the Union Army during the period of 1863 onward, with the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, on December 18th, 1865 would be the next significant act in the career of Harriet Tubman as an abolitionist. And it would be on this day that the federal Congress would pass the abolition of slavery, the abolishment of slavery. And it was proclaimed by William H. Seward, who was then Secretary of State, after both houses of Congress passed the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. It is also during the period prior to this, I guess you would say that William H. Seward became good friends with Harriet Tubman. They both were fellow abolitionists, and both were celebrating the event when Congress finally passes the abolition of slavery in December of 1865. The exact words of the 13th Amendment: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except for punishment of a crime whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their existence. Congress shall forever enforce the article by appropriate legislation. This is what the abolishment of slavery says in the exact words that it is listed in the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Much has been said of the respect that both William Seward and Harriet Tubman had for each other. They were good friends for a large portion of their lives. And outside the town of Schenectady, New York, near their town hall, is a statue dedicated to the friendship of these two abolitionists. They had both traveled in the same circles, and the Seward family had actually given Harriet's niece shelter in their home. And later on, the Seward family would welcome Harriet's parents to Auburn, New York, and they would make their way back to Auburn on their trip back from Canada during the years of the Fugitive Slave Act, which, of course, was in the 1850s. Now, the Tubman family became friends with the Seward family, and eventually William Seward would offer Harriet Tubman a piece of property and a home in which she would live with her family in 1859 onward, and that would be in Auburn, New York, in the community. And she would move her parents there and her niece. She makes her own way up to Auburn, New York, and stays there from 1859 onward. And she does purchase the piece of property from William Seward. And it would be here that Harriet Tubman would make her home for herself and her family. A little bit about William Seward, or William H. Seward. He was born May 16, 1801 in Florida, New York, and he passes away on October 10, 1872 at the age of 71, also in Auburn. During his career, which was quite extensive, he was a 24th U.S. Secretary of State from 1861 to 1869. He was a United States Senator from New York from 1849 to 1861. And he was also the 12th governor of New York in the years of 1839 to 1842. What William H. Seward will probably be known for the rest of his life, curiously enough, is not having been a avid abolitionist, but most people think of him as being responsible for the purchase of the state of Alaska, which the federal government did in 1867. At the time, they were thinking that it was a folly to have purchased the land because it was nothing more than a piece of frozen tundra, which many people have referred to other parts of Canada as, but Alaska turned out to be one of our more formidable states. And perhaps when you look back at it now, Seward's folly, which was called the purchase of Alaska, may have been very beneficial to the United States. Although to get there, you have to actually travel to Canada and another nation to get to the state of Alaska. This is the Seward House, which is up in Auburn, New York, and it's located at 33 South Street. And you can see it's a rather attractive structure. And during normal times, other than COVID, it is open for hours to tour and look at the place. But if anybody plans to go there now, I guess you're best to go to the website and call ahead of time, as you would with any historical building or place. But it is a beautiful structure. This is the Harriet Tubman House, which is also in Auburn, New York. This would have been the property that William H. Seward had sold to Harriet Tubman, and it becomes her residence in the years of 1859 to 1913 when she passes away. And the house still exists today too. An interior, it's a nice little cottage, and this gives you an idea of what it looks like from one view. And here's another view of the same cottage, the main room. And you can see it's nicely put together. Now, in the years when the Civil War ends, this woman of an incredible career, who was a abolitionist and served in the Civil War in many capacities, with the abolition of slavery in 1865, Harriet Tubman would take up another cause in her lifetime. And not too many people are probably as aware of the second part of her career. What Harriet does is she reinvents herself. And in the post-Civil War years, she becomes a member of the suffragette movement. And that was common, by the way, for a lot of abolitionists, that once they got rid of slavery with the abolishment of slavery in 1865, the next cause that the abolitionist movement would take up, and many of them were Quakers, by the way, again, is the movement to give women independence and rights that they were not given under the American Constitution in the years since we became a nation. And it's during this period of time in New York State when the Seneca Convention of 1848, 1849 would start up, and Harriet would have been involved in that. She would remain a colorful and avid speaker for the suffragette movement. And it was said at the time that she would attend meetings and befriend fellow suffragettes such as Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Emily Howland, and Lucretia Mott. And we'll talk about some of these folks too. Now, if you go to the Harriet Tubman homestead up in Auburn, New York, there's another building you might want to look at as well. And this would be the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged. She set up one of the first homes for people that grow old. And in the year of 1911, Harriet herself would be admitted to the building where she resides until her death on March 10th, 1913. And of course, she will be buried in the Fort Hill Cemetery. The Harriet Tubman site in Auburn, New York, is considered a National Historic Park, and it is run by the Park Service in partnership with the Tubman family. And anybody who would like to have a nice summer trip and learn a little bit more about Harriet Tubman, the spring or the summer would be a nice time to visit up there and perhaps see these historic places and buildings. Now, I mentioned the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848, but what it was is that two of the main speakers were Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And what they did is they put together rights that women of that particular era lacked. And these are rights that they felt were held by men under the American Constitution, but women were severely lacking of them. And they included the following: the right to own property, the right to attend college, the right to enter the law or medical professions, and the most controversial issue that would become the central point of the convention was the right of women to vote. And that would be the issue that would become the basis for the women's suffragette movement in the years that followed the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, folks who supported the suffragette movement included Frederick Douglass, abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison, an abolitionist from the Massachusetts area, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Emily Howland, who we'll talk about a little bit as we go on. The male speaker or guest of honor at that 1848 convention, of course, was Frederick Douglass. An illustration of Harriet Tubman as she would have spoken at one of the more colorful suffragette meetings. Now, what's interesting is that Harriet Tubman speaks up for all women's rights, but in the years after the Civil War, she would become a very prolific guest speaker at women's rights meetings. And she often traveled to New York, Boston, and Washington to speak in favor of women's rights and the suffragette movement. And the amazing thing about this is she was such a colorful speaker, but Harriet could neither read or write. And in spite of the fact that she could neither read or write, she was a popular guest speaker at these events, and her speeches were often well attended. She was especially interested in the rights of the Afro-American women's community and their right to vote as well. Illustration of what that famous convention would have looked like. Here's an illustration of one of the ladies speaking at the convention, and also the guest speaker, who would have been Frederick Douglass. Now, a little bit about some of the people that are major contributors to the suffragette movement. Emily Howland was born on November 20th, 1827 in Sherwood, New York. She dies June 29th, 1929 in Aurora, New York, at the age of 101. And in her career, she was considered an educator and a philanthropist, a civil rights activist, and a women's rights activist. And she was a strong supporter of education for the Afro-American community, and a strong supporter of the Tuskegee Institute, which became a famous Afro-American Institute of Higher Education. What's interesting about Emily is she was probably the only one of those original suffragettes who actually lives to see passage of the amendment to the American Constitution in 1920 that gives women the right to vote. She's the only surviving member of the original generation of suffragettes that actually saw the blessed event happen. Another member of that interesting body of women that Harriet Tubman would have associated with is Lucretia Mott, who was born Lucretia Coffin on January 3rd, 1783 in Nantucket, Massachusetts. She dies on November 11th, 1880 in Cheltenham, Pennsylvania at age 87. And during her lifetime, she was a teacher, abolitionist, and suffragette. And she was one of the key organizers of that convention in 1848. And that set of women's rights that was introduced at that convention, which we discussed, well, Lucretia Mott was the author of that document. And also, it is based on the original Declaration of Rights in the American Constitution. Susan B. Anthony, who's also another famous member of that generation, was born February 15th, 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts. She passes away on March 13th, 1906 at the age of 96. And at that time, she's living in Rochester, New York. Her burial place is the Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester. And during her lifetime, she was considered an American social reformer and women's rights activist. If you visit Rochester, New York, this is the Susan B. Anthony homestead. And many young ladies today who are part of the movement for more rights for women still visit Susan B. Anthony's homestead, as well as her gravesite outside of Rochester. Here's a picture of a lady, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, when she was younger. And this is a statue that's dedicated to the Seneca Convention. And noted in the middle, the male speaker would have been, of course, Frederick Douglass in this sculpture beneath. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is an older lady. She was born on November 12th, 1815 in Johnstown, New York. Passes away October 26, 1901 in New York City at the age of 86. And she's actually buried in the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. During her career, she was a writer, abolitionist, women's rights activist, and suffragette. And she's one of the two major organizers of that Seneca Falls Convention. Interesting enough, she also has a colorful career. Many of the women who were involved in the suffragette movement started out as members of the abolitionist movement of a generation earlier. And they just continued more of that progressive approach to, I guess, more freedoms for people, whether it's first with the abolition of slavery and later years for rights of women to vote, as well as those other key items were mentioned in the Lucretia Mott document. Here's the Harriet Tubman website, gravesite, actually, in Fort Hill Cemetery, her final resting place. And it's located a short distance from the National Historic Park in Auburn, New York. So people do go to visit this place as well and pay homage to Harriet Tubman. She was a very remarkable woman in many ways, and some of the key events in her life that we could note. She was born into slavery in 1822 under the name of Araminta Ross. She became known as in the African American community as the Moses of her people by leading people away from bondage and slavery in the South to the freedom of the North. She would perform this task as a member of the abolitionist movement, working as a conductor on what became known as the Underground Railroad, which consisted of safe houses and safe routes south into the northern states. She would also encourage both President Abraham Lincoln and fellow abolitionists in the American Congress to pass the Emancipation Proclamation Act in 1863, which frees slaves from captured Southern or Confederacy regions. And she would also convince those free slaves to join up with the Union Army, in their fight for freedom. She would also encourage the United States Congress to pass the abolition of slavery, which would become law with the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. And in her later years, she would go on to embrace the American suffragette movement and right of women to vote, something that's not always talked about. In 2019, Harriet Tubman, her story leading up to the Civil War years was discussed in the movie Harriet, which was released in 2019. It actually had its premiere at the Toronto Film Festival on September 10th of 2019, and its American release came 2 months later in November. And the film itself is based on her activities on the Underground Railroad and in the years leading up to the Civil War, but it doesn't really cover those other years when she was involved in the suffragette movement. But the movie itself is an interesting film, and it runs about 125 minutes. And it did receive an Academy Award and a Globe Screen Actors Award nomination for the song Stand Up. And it also had a Oscar nomination for Best Song in the year of 2019. Now, what do we think about Harriet Tubman and her place in history? This is interesting, her legacy. The woman who was called Moses led her people to freedom on an underground railroad, and she left her mark on American history, not only with a museum and national park that celebrated her life and accomplishments in Auburn, New York, but she also has an additional museum and national park in Maryland as well, where she was born. And what makes that unique, she's the only figure in American history to have 2 federal museums and parks dedicated to her. That's quite an accomplishment for a woman who could hardly read and write and had very little education, and yet could also become such a major guest speaker on women's rights in her later years. She not only proved her place in American history as one of the women of major significance, but she helped to make our nation a better place in which to live and prosper as well. And even in Cape May, New Jersey, which would have been one of the places perhaps that Harriet may have frequented on her trips on the Underground Railroad, they have also put together a little museum exhibit, which if you're ever in Cape May, you can visit as well. Now, this is kind of a wonderful thing for Harriet, and I'm so glad it happened to see her get recognition. There was one consideration at a point to put her on American currency, and what they were thinking about at the time was the $20 bill. And at one point, it would have died out in Congress. The original idea the Treasury Department wanted to do was replace Andrew Jackson with Harriet Tubman. And what happened is the movement to do that was put on hold until recently. And now that looks like it's going to become part of the future. Harriet Tubman will get her place of honor in the years to come on the $20 bill. And the Treasury Department is currently still working on that, and hopefully soon we'll put it into place. This is what it would have looked like when it was originally proposed in 2016. And it's probably what the final prototype would look like as well. Anybody who's interested in learning a little more about Harriet Tubman, I could recommend 2 wonderful books. Harriet, The Moses of Her People by Sarah Hopkins Bradford, and Harriet Tubman, The Road to Freedom by Catherine Clinton. These are books you can either look for in your local library here, or perhaps even on Amazon if you wish to own a copy of your own. I believe they are both available in hardcover as well as paperback. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation on the life and times of Harriet Tubman and the road to freedom in honor of Black History Month. And it was brought to you by courtesy of the Moffat Library and presented by myself, Leon DiMartino. And I thank you for choosing to attend this particular presentation.